Good morning, children. I'm Purnima, and once again, I welcome you all to my class. And children, today I'm going to revise the same lesson, that is chapter 5 of your supplementary book, Reader. And the name of the chapter is Mother's Day. Now, as I told you, it is written by J.B. Priestley. And let me give you some small introduction of this play. The play is written by J.B. Priestley, reveals how a mother's effort are ignored by her family. So, you will see when I will narrate it, when I will explain it, you can see how her effort, she works so hard for her family, but in spite of that, everybody ignores her. Okay, and it narrates how the family members who works 8-hour shifts a day look upon her work. She works for the whole day and all week. So she is the one who work day and night, but they neglect, they feel that she is not working at all. She works for the whole day and all week. After all, she does for them and they take it for granted. They make her feel obligated to provide for them and do not even appreciate her effort. So they don't appreciate her effort. They are not show any children gratitude to her. Okay, it revolves around how her friend Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is a fortune teller, helps her, earns the place and respect she deserves as the woman of the house. Now children, I will be telling you about the main point. I will just revise, okay, in short I will revise the main points of the story, and today we will be doing the explanation of the story. So children, the Mother Day begins with two friends having a candid conversation at Mrs. Pearson's house. And yesterday I've discussed about characters also. Two friends were there. One was Mrs. Pearson, Annie Pearson, and her friend Mrs. Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald, she used to see the fortune, okay, and she visits to her house and she tells Mrs. Pearson that she would like to see her hand as she wanted to tell her fortune. So the drama begins with this student, and then daughter of Mrs. Pearson is there, husband is there, his name is George, then son Cyril is here, okay, and Doris Pearson is the name of a daughter. So these are all the characters in this play. So Mrs. Pearson goes about telling how her family members don't value her. When she shows her hand to her, she tells Mrs. Pearson that her family member don't value her and don't appreciate at all whatever she does for them. And she is available for them all the 24 hours for 7 days, and they do what is their duty? Nothing at their house. They come, they just pass orders to her and leave even without saying thank you. Mrs. Fitzgerald tells her to take her stand as the woman of the house, but Mrs. Pearson, being the sweet and innocent lady, doesn't want to bring her family any sort of discomfort. She felt that everything is going on smoothly. If I'm doing what, no matter, let me do my work. This is the duty I'm feeling. I have to do it. And if I will tell somebody, so they will all get disturbed and they will feel discomfortable. She continues to handle their tantrums because she doesn't know where to begin. And the fact is that she children continues to face their tantrums because she doesn't know from where to begin them and how to make them disciplined. Mrs. Fitzgerald proposes a idea to her, and she know a art that how to switch their bodies so that Mrs. Fitzgerald takes her place without her family knowing. She told we will exchange our bodies, okay, and your family members will not know me that I am Mrs. Fitzgerald. Instead, they will just know me as Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson is hesitant at first, but then Mrs. Fitzgerald convinces her for it. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she convinces her. She tells me just because of for you only, I'm doing all this thing. Mrs. Fitzgerald performs her magic that she had learned from the East, and their personalities are changed now. So that magic she has learned from the East when her husband was in army and he was posted there in the eastern side. So she has learned this magic there. Now Mrs. Fitzgerald is actually in Mrs. Pearson's body and vice versa. Now new Mrs. Pearson tell Mrs. Fitzgerald to go to her house for the time being. So new Mrs. Pearson, that means exactly she was Mrs. Fitzgerald. She tell Mrs. Fitzgerald, who actually was Mrs. Pearson, to go to her house for the time being, as this she is doing for her only and for the sake of her family. So she do like that, she leaves her house. Okay. And uh, she did not want to go, but then she feels that Mrs. Fitzgerald is taking so much pain for her, so she must go to her house for the time being. At this moment in the play, Darius Pearson, who is a daughter of Mrs. Ann Pearson, she enters the scene asking for tea and ordering Mrs. Pearson to iron her yellow silk dress. She gets shocked at the sight of her mother when she saw that her mother was smoking, because she had never seen her mother smoking and drinking. The arguments begin when Mrs. Pearson insults Charlie Spence. Charlie Spence. Charlie Spence was a boyfriend of Miss Doris Pearson, and with whom she has to go today for date. The guy she's about to go out with. Dory leaves crying, and Cyril, her brother, enters asking for tea and something to eat. Now, children, Dory feels very bad when Mrs. Pearson, she refused that she is not going to press her iron dress, and she insults Charlie Spence. Now, children, she leaves crying, while as now her brother entered. He is asking, he's ordering for tea, and he wanted something to eat. He too is amazed at having come home to see there's nothing to eat and no tea to drink. Now, children, every day his tea was served and the food was served to him, but he was shocked to see that today no tea and nothing to eat was there. He asked if anything is wrong. Mrs. Pearson tells him that she had never felt better. So Mrs. Pearson told him, I'm feeling much better today and nothing is wrong. Cyril gets annoyed and Doris joins him, where they are told that Mrs. Pearson might even take the weekend off. Now children, both the children are shocked when she tell her children that she is going to take her weekend off. Next, George Pearson enters. Now, children, her husband enters the scene, shocked to see his wife day drinking. He had never seen his wife drinking wine. That day she was drinking in the day only. He announces that he has some special match at the club and that he won't be requiring any tea this afternoon. So he just came to say that today he won't be requiring any tea because he had to go to see some special match at the club. On being told there is no tea, he gets annoyed again. Now Mrs. Pearson told him, I already had not prepared any tea for you. He gets a bit annoyed. Mrs. Pearson mocks him for getting annoyed at not getting something he did not actually want. She tells him about the names they call him at the club. Now children, Mrs. Pearson, who is very lonely because her husband, instead of passing times with her, he generally visits the club. So she tells him that why he goes there every time where he is being insulted. People call him there by different name. She further taunts him that this would not have happened had he stayed at home once in a while. Now children, she gives her idea that this is happening because he never stays at home. He always go to the club. After a while, Mrs. Fitzgerald enters. She interferes in their family matters. George gets annoyed when Mrs. Fitzgerald calls him by his name. So George is annoyed when Mrs. Fitzgerald called him by his name. But just like it had been happening all day, Mrs. Pearson barges in to bring George on track. Doris enters the scene and she too is not very pleasant to Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Pearson brings her on track too. At this point, Mrs. Fitzgerald, actually she is Mrs. Pearson, loses her cool and asks the family members to excuse the two friends for a moment. She promises them that she knows how to make the situation better. Mrs. Fitzgerald resists at first, but later she agrees to do it. They repeat the process they did in the first place, that means exchanging of the bodies. The real Mrs. Fitzgerald now explained Mrs. Pearson how important it is for her to be a bit dominating once in a while. Now, so she is advising her that I have seen the situation and you have to be dominating, otherwise you will lose control over everything. So she is telling you have to be dominating once in a while to establish her control and respect. Otherwise, she is telling you will not get any respect also. The family enters and Mrs. Pearson suggests that they play rummy and the kids make supper. Now, children, a decision was taken that day, though everybody did not had heart to tell no. The decision was that the family enters and Mrs. Pearson suggests that they will play rummy and the kids will make supper today. Everyone instantly agrees. Now, children, everybody agrees to it, and they are a bit relieved too. And children, they are a bit relieved because now she is not insulting any one of the family. Instead, she, in a very cool way, she is telling them to work. Mrs. Fitzgerald exit and the play end. So, children, you can see that this lesson, how nicely children, Mrs. Fitzgerald help her to gain her respect in the family. She wanted every member of the family should value her. Okay, and she advises her to be a bit dominating and don't work like an ass every time, otherwise she will lose everything, her control over family. Now, children, this play is a humorous portrayal of the status of the mother in a family. Now, children, what was the status of the mother who used to be housewife early? Okay, this her status was nothing. Nobody used to respect her. She was a considered as a permanent servant at home. Okay, doing all the work, and she tries to now here. Mrs. Pearson family reacts when she tries to stand up for her own right. And now, children, I have already discussed the character with you. There are five characters. One is Mrs. Annie Pearson. Then George Pearson is her husband. Doris Pearson is her daughter. Cyril Pearson is her son. And Mrs. Fitzgerald is her friend who helped her to gain the value of her in the family. The action takes place in the living room of the Pearson house in London. Okay, so this is all, children. Okay, and now I will be explaining you about the play. But before that, I would like to tell you something. I would like to tell you actually what was the status of women at that time. So the status of women at that time was nothing. Okay, this play was written in 1950 and is used to considered as humorous and satirical uh, depiction of the status of the mother in the family. So she was treated very badly, no respect, no value was given to her. She was, and there's no appreciation of a housewife's role and her responsibility. She used to work like an unpaid domestic servant who carried the orders of other. They neither request her nor thanks her for anything. And the second issue is children. The here the husband and the children, they never show their gratitude. They never show their love to Mrs. Pearson. So this is again a very important point of this play. Now, children, we will begin the play, and let me tell you, this is a humorous play and this is a satirical play, and the scene here is the house of Mrs. Pearson. It's a villa, actually it's not a house, and there are so many furniture are kept there in the scene. It is saying that so many furniture are there, so many things are there in her room, but the furnitures are old, but it is often every time it is used. So This is the situation of Mrs. Pearson house. Now children, the play begin with the some of the narrative part that I am going to explain it right now. Now children, the scene the play is started with the scene of Mrs. Pearson house. So I will be reading and I will be explaining you about the scene which is there. Okay. So scene is the living room of the Pearson family. What is the scenario? The scene is the living room of the Pearson family. Afternoon, and the children, the time is afternoon. It is a comfortably furnished, much lived in room in a small suburban semi-detached villa. So children, it is a furnished house, well furnished house, much lived in room in a small suburban. Suburban means outskirt of the city. So what is the meaning of suburban? Outskirt of the city. And children, her villa is situated. What is the villa? Actually is known to French bungalow is known to be as villa, and children, it is surrounded by garden. So that house, it is a comfortably furnished, much lived in room in a small suburban semi-detached wall. It is attached with a wall. If necessary, only one door needs to be open. So children, what is there are doors also, but one door is there which is opened every time. So this was the this villa was at the outskirt of the city. Now children, only there two doors are there, but only one door of the house of the villa is used. Okay, then the description of that place is there, and but it is better with two, one up left leading to the front door and the stairs, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. So children, the two doors are open. One is leading to the front door and the stairs portion, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. There can be a muslin covered window. What is a muslin? Thin curtain. Okay, a thin curtain of muslin was covering the window in the left wall and possibly one in the right wall. The fireplace is assumed to be in the fourth wall. So in the fourth side of the wall there was a fireplace. There is a settee upright. Settee, children, is a small chair for sitting. There was a settee upright, an armchair down left and one down right. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stand at the center. When the curtain rises, it is an afternoon in early autumn and the stage can be well lit. Mrs. Pearson at right. Now children, now who are there inside the room? So it is Mrs. Pearson who is sitting at the right side of the table, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is there who is sitting at the left. They are sitting opposite to each other at the small table, on which are two teacups and saucers and the cards with which Mrs. Fitzgerald has been telling Mrs. Pearson fortune. So two cups and saucers were there, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, she has been telling Mrs. Pearson fortune through the card. Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant but worried looking woman in her 40s. So what was the age? She was in her 40s, and she was looking a bit worried. Mrs. Pearson is older, heavier, and a strong and sinister personality. While as Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is much older, she is much healthier, much heavier, and she is strong with sinister means with the evil personality. She is smoking. It is very important that these two should have sharply contrasting voice. And not only children, that their voice were also contrasting. Mrs. Pearson was having a light, soft voice for it, okay, with a touch of suburban cockney, perhaps, and Mrs. Fitzgerald with a deep voice, rather Irish. Her accent were Irish. Okay, so now children, I'm going to read the dialogues and I'm going to explain the play. In the book, you can see children, the two ladies is sitting. One is looking very rough. Okay, teacups are there and the card is there. Mrs. Fitzgerald collecting up the card. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is collecting her tarot card. And that's all I can tell you, Mrs. Pearson. Could be a good fortune, could be a bad one. Now she is telling Mrs. Pearson, she wanted to know about her fortune. So she is telling by picking her card that your fortune can be a good one, also a bad one. All depend on you. So that means children, this is the message of the story, that you yourself is the maker of your fortune. Whatever you will do, the result will be your fortune. You can change your fortune by working hard, by thinking very seriously on each of the things which you do. All depend on yourself. Now make up your mind and there it is. Only thing you have to make up your mind and there the fortune goes for you. The story begins with both Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald sitting opposite each other at Mrs. Pearson's place. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a fortune teller and she has supposedly seen Mrs. Pearson's fortune. Thus she continues to say that she has told her all that is within her capacity to tell. The same reading can work in a positive way also if Mrs. Pearson's action are uh, um, be um, be told in a positive manner, and if Mrs. Pearson action are in sync with it, or it could turn out to be a bad mood. That means she wanted to tell that how she will behave now from now onward, that will make her fortune. Okay, till now nobody was respecting her, nobody was giving any value to her because of her children. She was not strict, she was not dominating, she was not controlling anyone. Whatever everybody feel like, they used to say to her. Mrs. Pearson now saying, "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I'm much obliged. I'm sure it's wonderful having a real fortune teller living next door. Did you learn that out east too?" Now Mrs. Pearson, she's very happy. She is telling that I'm very happy that a wonderful fortune teller is my neighbor. And then she's asking from where does she learn the fortune. Did you learn out east too? That means she's learned the art of fortune telling from the east. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I did. Now she is telling, yes, I did. 12 years I had of it with my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster. He learned a lot and I learned a lot more. Now children, she told when her husband was in the army, okay, he was a lieutenant quartermaster, he learned a lot and I learned a lot more. But will you make up your mind? Okay, uh, Mrs. Pearson, dear, put your foot down. Put your foot down. That means now you have to take very strict actions against their wishes, once and for all. Whatever you will do now, that will be your lifetime achievement. And be the mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family. And she is advising her that now you have to be the mistress of your own house and you have to be the boss of your family. Till now they were not respecting you, they were not listening to you, they were not they were every time insulting with you. So now those days are gone. She motivates Mrs. Pearson to stand for herself and get the respect she should deserve at her home. Now, children, Mrs. Pearson is smiling apologetically. That's easier said than done. Now, she is telling it is easy to say, but it is very difficult to do. Besides, I am so fond of them, even if they are so thoughtless and selfish, they don't mean to be. Now, children, thoughtless here is a person on the whose behavior is something very odd. They doesn't show any consideration for the needs of the other people. So this is the meaning of thoughtlessness here. So Mrs. Pearson, she is telling that I really care for my family. I love them very much and I'm very much fond of them. In spite of that, they never think of me and they are very selfish. They don't mean to be thought they don't need to be children. She wanted to say they don't want to, I did not want to ignore them. She loves to provide for them even if they are self-centered. She told me I would like to work for them even if they are selfish, even if they are self-centered. Mrs. Fitzgerald, cutting in. Maybe not, but it would be better for them if they learn to treat you properly. Mrs. Fitzgerald says, anyway, they should treat you properly because you are really sacrificed for them. So Mrs. Fitzgerald wants Mrs. Pearson to realize that it is not that difficult if she really tries. Moreover, she thinks it would add to their well-being as well if they behave with love and respect with her. Mrs. Pearson, yes, I suppose it would in a way. Mrs. Pearson agrees with what Mrs. Fitzgerald has to say. So, children, both the ladies, they are talking, they are sharing, children, their views. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she really wanted, nobody should insult her. Why should she sacrifice her life, because she is doing a lot for them. Though she doesn't go outside for work, she doesn't go to office, so what, she is doing a lot of domestic work from morning till evening. They only pass orders, okay. They never show their gratitude, they never show their children, what to say, they are never show thanks to her, they did not show that they love her, okay. She is so neglected, only thing they come and they give their order, and she works like servant all from morning till evening. Mrs. Pearson, she just follow whatever the order is given to them, okay. She just follow the order, which is not like my Mrs. Fitzgerald. She wanted that uh, what is the use of that war when nobody is treating her properly, nobody is giving her any respect in the family. So she feels that this is not a good thing. Now, children, it is Mrs. Fitzgerald. She really start caring for her friend when she sees her hand, and she tells everything. She tells a nice solution to her. And she really wanted that the family member should behave well and they should really respect her, because she does a lot for her family. She never bothers anything, even if they doesn't if they shout at her and her husband ignores her too much, he doesn't pass time with her, then also she does a lot of things which does Mrs. Fixer, or she did not like all this thing. She want that she should be treated properly, she should give a due respect, and everybody should take care of her also, as she is a mother and she is a wife, uh, holding a very important post in the house. Well, then she tell that she thinks it would add to their well-being as well as if they behave with love and respect with her. Mrs. Pearson agree with what Mrs. Pearson has to say. Now, children, finally she agrees. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald is telling, no doubt about it at all. Who is the better for being spoiled? Grown man, lad, or girl? Now, children, she's asking, who is the most spoiled person of your house? The old man. Old man is in. Is her husband. Lad. Lad means her son. Girl. Girl is her daughter. Nobody. You think it doesn't then good when you run after them all the time, and she is telling, then they are not taking caring for you, then why are you running after them? You are taking their orders as if you were the servant in the house, just like the servant of the house takes the order. If you are behaving in that manner, stay at home every night while they go out enjoying themselves. After coming from the office, these people, they are going to enjoy every night. Never in all your life, and you never enjoyed, never even thought of enjoying in all your life. It's the ruin of them as well you. So she's saying, this is the, it is the ruin of them as well as you. Husband, son, daughter should be taking notice of wives and mother, not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. So she's telling, It is a duty of husband, it is a duty of a daughter, it is a duty of a son to take care of their wife and children, their mother. They should not pass orders and treat them like dirt. And don't tell me you don't know what I mean, for I know more than you have told me. Now she is telling, and don't you ever hide anything. I know about you, whatever you have told me. In fact, I know more than what you have told me. So Mrs. Fitzgerald said they need to learn to treat Mrs. Pearson in a nice manner. She further added that none of them, that is her husband, her daughter and son, have turned out positively as a result of being spoiled by Mrs. Pearson. And she tells Mrs. Pearson, you are the one who had spoiled them. She enables her to see how running after them, handling their tantrums, doing all their tasks for them and staying home while they enjoy every night is harmful for Mrs. Pearson as well as for her family. So she is telling, in your family there is no healthy atmosphere. She explained how it should be the other way around. The family must treat wife and mothers with full respect and be after them instead of throwing orders. Mrs. Fitzgerald bluntly tells Mrs. Pearson not to act unknown, and she is completely aware of the situation. Mrs. Pearson dubiously, I keep dropping a hint. Dubiously means with hesitation or doubt. So what is the meaning of dubiously, children? Dubiously means with hesitation or doubt. Okay, dubious. Okay, with hesitation or doubt. So children, here Mrs. Pearson, she says that she often tries to give her and the family clues in between conversation. She told me it's not that I also give them clues, I also give them hints to my family that I also want some help, I also want their support, but they never listen to me. Mrs. Fitzgerald, hint, it's more than hints your family needs, Mrs. Pearson. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to make her understand that it is high time and Mrs. Pearson family should respect her now. Okay, whatever they have done, forget it. She's telling her friend, and now it's a time, high time, that they should realize that you work so much for them and they should respect you now, and that would require more than just clues. They need to be brought on track. Or she's telling, instead of giving clues, instead of giving hints, they should be brought on the track. So children, this was the two friends are talking, they are sharing their feeling, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is very blunt, but they say what to say. She wanted to support her friend. She doesn't like that her friend situation is not good in her family. So children, with this I conclude my video here, and children, in my next video you are going to learn more about this play. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.